Compact cameras can save you a lot of space, but they often come with a sacrifice in quality. So in this video, I'm going to show you cameras that would be perfect for vlogging, travel, fitness, or any kind of content that you're making without having to sacrifice any quality. And as always, you'll see links in the description down below for the best and the most current pricing on all the products that we talk about today, so be sure to check that out. So the first camera we're going to talk about is the G7X Mark III. Now this is probably one of the most popular travel and vlogging cameras in recent history, and I know it had its issues when it first launched with autofocus, but thankfully that has all been fixed and the autofocus is pretty solid now. The G7X Mark III is incredibly small and durable. It's perfect for someone who's always on the go. Now it has three features that make it a really interesting camera, and that's design, autofocus, and color science. So let's talk about them. The G7X Mark III has a flip-up screen that comes up to the top. Now this screen allows for two really important features in this camera. One, it has touch autofocus, so you can simply tap something on the screen and it will immediately grab focus to that object, whether it's an object or a person. And second, it also has touch controls, which means you can operate 98% of this camera without having to use any buttons, which makes this camera about as easy to use as a smartphone. Plus, it has an input for external audio like shotgun mics or wireless lavs. However, for most people traveling, they will probably want to keep their camera setup really small, and for you guys, I do recommend using the internal audio instead. But I'm happy to say the internal audio is really solid in this camera. It will get the job done for 98% of you guys out there, but you will struggle if you're in a noisy environment like a party or a beach. But what about image quality when it comes to photos and videos? Well, the G7X Mark III has a 20 megapixel sensor, which is exactly what you would want in a small compact camera like this. Plus, because it's a Canon camera, it has really good colors right in camera. Canon cameras are actually known for their spectacular color science. Skin tone and faces always look vibrant and fresh, so you can be sure that you're going to look your best on this camera. However, what makes this camera really badass is the built-in lens. It has a focal length from 24 to 100 millimeters, which means not only can you get wide shots for landscapes and group shots, but you can also zoom in for close-up shots for portraits or sports games. Plus, on top of everything else, it has a variable aperture between f1.8 and f2.8, which makes this camera very, very good in low light, and it gives you that cinematic, blurry background look naturally. This lens allows for a ton of flexibility when shooting, which is exactly what you want in a small compact camera, basically a Swiss Army knife that does a little bit of everything. The G7X Mark III shoots blazing fast photos at 20 frames per second with continuous autofocus. That is almost as fast as video. Even though it's a small compact camera, it's fast enough to shoot any kind of fast moving action. This is normally something you would want a DSLR for, but this camera absolutely handles it. As for video, it shoots full 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second. This is really useful for vloggers and travelers just to make sure that you guys are capturing everything in the highest quality possible. And in full HD mode, it shoots 120 frames per second and 60 frames per second for 5 times and 2 times slow motion. Now, slow motion is really useful for capturing epic moments on a trip or just making things look more interesting. And if you do want to save a little bit of cash, just a tiny bit of cash, the G7X Mark II is the older version and it's also cheaper. It doesn't have 4K or 120 frames per second, and there's no input for external audio, but the onboard audio is super solid. And if you don't need a lot of those fancy features, it does make sense for you to save money and get the older G7X Mark II version. But for those of you who want a premium experience, the G7X Mark III is a great camera for travelers, beginners, and vloggers. It's compact, it gives you everything you need to get started right away. Now, the only thing that the G7X Mark III lacks is a larger sensor for a more cinematic look. But if that is something you want, I do have a camera later in this list that's going to be compact, and I promise you the image quality from this camera is going to blow your mind. Alright, so the next camera we have to talk about is the ZV-1. The Sony ZV-1 is actually pretty close to the Canon G7X Mark III, and I personally think it's a really close race. However, Sony cameras do a few things that really set them apart from Canon cameras and really everything else out there. For starters, the Sony ZV-1 is really designed for content creators and social media users in mind. If you're someone that's heavily using Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, this is the camera for you. But if you're just a casual shooter, you can trust that you're getting the best camera possible for you. Now, the sensor in the Sony ZV-1 is a 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor. It seems like it's the same sensor, but there's a few things that this sensor does which really set it apart. For example, it's really good in low light. You can easily shoot this camera as high as 6400 ISO and you will get minimal noise. The colors aren't as vivid or pleasing to the eye as Canon cameras. However, that does not mean that Sony cameras have bad colors. Sony has consistently improved their color technology with every single camera, and I have to say the Sony ZV-1 looks so much better than a Sony camera from 2 to 3 years ago. The Sony ZV-1 has a 24mm to 70mm lens with a variable aperture of f1.8 to f2.8, which is another thing that makes this camera really good in low light. So you can easily get wide shots and close-up shots, but you won't be able to get quite as close as the Canon G7X Mark III. However, I would argue that the Sony Zeiss lens is sharper and will give you better images compared to the G7X Mark III. Plus, the ZV-1 has optical stabilization, whereas the G7X Mark III only has digital stabilization. In case you don't know, optical is better. However, if you want a camera with a huge zoom and you really want to be able to shoot things that are really far away, I would recommend checking out the RX100 Mark VI. It's a pretty similar camera when it comes to the internal specs, but it has a lens from 24 to 200 millimeters. This is absolute insanity, especially when you consider that this is a compact camera. Now, the RX100 Mark VI isn't quite as good in low light, but that's a small sacrifice to make for that insane zoom lens. But back to the ZV-1. So how is the ZV-1 when it comes to photos and videos? In terms of photos, the ZV-1 actually shoots at 24 frames per second, which is pretty much as fast as live video, so it's pretty much impossible to miss a shot with this camera. The ZV-1 is basically a baby DSLR, but in a compact body. And the video in the ZV-1 is just as impressive. It does full 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second, which looks amazing when it comes to vlogging, fitness, and fashion content, or really even a talking head video like this. And in full HD, it does 24, 30, 60, and 120 frames per second for slow motion. But this camera has a really unique feature, and that is ultra slow motion. It does 240, 480, and 960 frames per second. This is unheard of in a consumer level camera. Normally you need at least a $10,000 professional camera for something like this. But I will say this, the higher you go up on the slow motion frame rate, the worse the quality goes. Personally, I think 480 frames per second, which is 20 times slow motion, is the sweet spot. Everything in this camera is geared towards creativity, and the specs and design definitely back it up. The design is perfect for someone who's moving quickly through their shoot or is trying to get interesting and beautiful photos and videos. The button layout is minimal. There's two separate record buttons. One is a photo shutter and one is a photo video, so you never have to fiddle around and try to figure out what does what. It keeps operations simple and easy. Plus, it also has a Bluetooth grip, which is unfortunately sold separately for a little bit extra money, but it allows you to use it as a vlogging handle. It has a record button and a zoom toggle right on the grip. And also it's wireless, so you can operate this camera from far away. The battery life on the ZV-1 isn't the greatest, but the more recent firmware updates have improved the battery life on this camera, but I would definitely recommend keeping a spare. Also, one thing that I have to mention about the ZV-1 is the amazing internal audio. This internal audio actually uses 3 internal mics, which makes the onboard audio with this camera as good as an external shotgun mic. Not only is this going to save you a whole bunch of money, but it's also going to make your camera setup that much smaller. The ZV-1 is a great compact camera for someone who's pretty experienced or someone who's brand new to cameras. This is truly a one-size-fits-all type of deal. The ZV-1 can literally be used by anybody. The only bad thing that I have to say about the ZV-1 is that it does have a smaller sensor like the G7X Mark III. And because of that, you'll never really get the proper look of a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. But if you are someone that's already shooting or is looking to get started and you want a compact camera that doesn't have the limitations of a smaller sensor, the next camera is the camera that I've been talking about this entire video, and it will absolutely blow your mind. And that camera is the Canon M6 Mark II. This is a truly unique camera because it has a 32 megapixel APS-C size sensor, plus it has the ability to change lenses, which is extremely rare within the compact camera category. And within the compact camera category, it's actually the highest resolution camera on the market. With this sensor, you're going to be able to capture everything at the highest quality possible, and the bigger sensor is going to make everything look much more cinematic. When it comes to design, the buttons are fairly minimal and it has a top flip-up screen. The M6 Mark II is very similar to the G7X Mark III with touch autofocus and touch control functionality. In case you skipped the earlier section, this camera allows you to simply touch an object on your screen to catch focus similar to an iPhone. Plus, it also allows you to operate the entire camera simply using the touchscreen, much like a smartphone. Because it's a bigger sensor, it also requires a much more robust focusing system. Now, Canon's dual pixel autofocusing system actually intelligently tracks faces and objects moving within your frame, which makes keeping everything in focus much easier. This camera does most of the work for you, and it works really well in both photo and video mode. So let's talk about exactly what this camera does when it comes to photos and videos. First of all, this camera is fast. It shoots 14 frames per second in photo mode, which is fast enough to capture any kind of travel photos, fast moving action, even cars whizzing by. It's not quite as fast as the point and shoot cameras we mentioned earlier, but you have to remember it's also a bigger sensor. Plus, this camera shoots in 14-bit RAW with 32 megapixels of resolution. You're really getting the image quality of a professional camera when you shoot with the M6 Mark II. Also, on top of that, it has the spectacular Canon colors right in camera, so everything pretty much looks amazing right out of camera. Even if you're just shooting JPEGs, you're going to get amazing colors no matter what. And video is where this camera really shines. It does 4K video at 24 and 30 frames per second with no crop. Most cameras in this category tend to crop the sensor when you go into 4K mode, but thankfully this camera does not have that issue. And the 4K itself is really sharp and crisp and definitely good enough for high quality professional use if you want to use it for that. In full HD resolution, it shoots at 24 and 30 frames per second in real time, but it also has slow motion available at 120 frames per second in full HD. So the great thing about the M6 Mark II is that you basically get all the benefits of a compact camera, but you get the horsepower and technology of a proper DSLR. And I really dig the fact that this camera is so small. The M6 can easily fit into your jacket pocket or backpack. It's really like having a proper DSLR in your pocket, but it does lack a lot of the design elements that you get from a DSLR, like a side articulating screen, a big battery, or dual audio jack. So there's still plenty of reason to buy a proper DSLR for pro work. So who is the M6 Mark II really for? If you've ever wanted a proper DSLR and you really want the best you can get technology-wise, but you just don't want a big bulky camera, the M6 Mark II is exactly for you. You get all the horsepower of a proper camera, but in a small compact body. I review dozens of cameras on this channel every single year, and I absolutely love this stuff. But what really matters when it comes to getting great photos and videos is learning how to use the camera that you have right now to its full potential, even if that camera is a smartphone. And that's why I created a free training video on my 7 simple secrets that will show you how to get the most out of the gear that you're using right now. I put a link in the description down below, so be sure to check that out and start improving your work right away. And if you guys have any questions about the products that we talked about today, or if you guys want to know where to get the best pricing and the most up-to-date pricing on these products, make sure to check out the links in the description down below for the best pricing on these cameras. With that being said, I will either see you in the free training or in the next video. Peace.